Hello and welcome to a new episode of Africa Today. We are talking today about the situation in South Sudan and shedding the light on the latest update there in this country. And to know more about South Sudan crisis, we are joined in the studio by Ambassador Ahmed Haggag, former Assistant Secretary General of the OAU. Hello, sir, and welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Now the UN said that fighting in South Sudan has forced tens of thousands to flee the country. This month alone, has the world abandoned this country?
The world did not abandon this country. I think the United Nations and the regional organization, they got very much interested in the situation in South Sudan after the rupture in the leadership of that country between the government of President Salva Kiir and a segment of this government under the control of the Vice President, Mr. Riek Machar. And many meetings have been held through the African Union, the United Nations, the European Union, IGAD, between the two factions, and many agreements have been signed, but no avail. The fighting continued between the two factions.
Okay, the humanitarian organization decided to withdraw from South Sudan. They are used to operate in dangerous zones. Why did they take such a decision so far?
Because there is a danger about official working in this humanitarian assistance. I would like to mention that South Sudan, when it was declared independence, it was a very fragile country without any infrastructure, and it depended completely on the proceeds of the oil, which have been suspended now due to the fighting. And by the way, this is affecting North Sudan, since the transit revenue of oil from South Sudan was the backbone of the North Sudan budget, and ceased now. The United Nations harbored centers, harbored tens of thousands of South Sudanese, but now the influx of those displaced persons are overwhelming. That's why we find almost 500,000 South Sudanese without any shelter, food, or water, and there is nobody to assist them.
Sir, can you brief us about the humanitarian needs in South Sudan?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Can you brief us about the humanitarian needs in South Sudan and how the situation is growing every day and moving in the wrong direction?
The international humanitarian assistance is overwhelmed, not only in South Sudan, but in other parts in the world, especially now in Nepal and in Darfur and in other parts in Africa. That's why the international community is being despaired after interference to bring a reconciliation between the two parties, and after an agreement has been signed, there is little respect to adhere to this agreement. That's why the United Nations and regional organizations are almost lost hope in bringing the two factions together and prevent the humanitarian situation from being turned to a catastrophic situation. And as I mentioned, South Sudan is now in the middle of humanitarian catastrophe unless the people of South Sudan themselves bring this situation under control.
And how far the government is playing a role in worsening the humanitarian situation of the South Sudanese people?
The government of President Salva Kiir is doing its best to cope with this situation, but as I mentioned, the needs for the humanitarian assistance is overwhelming, and it could not cope with such a situation. And there is a decreasing in the international assistance, and the people of South Sudan are the ones who are taking the brunt of this worsening situation.
And has the government been able to improve the security since the peace deal was signed late in February this year?
What is the first part of your question, please?
Has the government been able to improve the security situation in South Sudan since a peace deal was signed in February this year?
South Sudan is a big country with a small security apparatus. That's why, which allow the rebel group to roam around unhindered. Whenever there is a calm in part of the country, another part is opening a new front against the government forces. So the international community could be deceived by the lull in the fighting, but security and movement of the people around the country is very limited. Furthermore, it's not only between the fighting between the government forces and the rebel forces. There is a tribal fighting and cattle rustling between the tribes, the major tribes of the area of the country, and this is a big impediment about calming the security situation in that country.
Sir, from your own point of view, what has changed since the ceasefire deal between President Salva Kiir and his former Vice President Riek Machar was signed? Do you believe there is a difference now after the peace deal was signed, or the situation as is?
In the fighting leading to the independence of South Sudan, the SPLA seemed a very united organization. They did have determination to gain independence, and the world celebrated with joy the independence movement. But unfortunately, some tribal affiliation did interfere to bring a fragmentation of this united front, and this is going on in spite of all the efforts by the United Nations, individual country, Ethiopia, and the regional organization like IGAD. Egypt tried its best to bring the fighting faction together, and I think this was one of the subjects which was discussed during the visit of the Foreign Minister of Egypt, Mr. Sameh Shukri.
And what is more needed from the Juba government in order to adhere to the international law and allow the needy aids to its civilian? What the government should do now?
The IGAD community, which including all the countries of East Africa, including South Sudan, North Sudan, Uganda, Sudan, and others, assisted by members of the international community, especially the United States, Britain, and Norway, have tried its best to bring a stop to the fighting. But it seemed that the tribal disagreement is stronger than the united front which was achieved at the independence. So the root causes of this tribal fighting has to be tackled first before we could consider that this agreement will be implemented.
And sir, the situation now in South Sudan, we have both sides, the government from one hand and the rebels on the other hand. Both are blaming each other for the deteriorating situation in the country. How do you see that? What's your take on that?
Even the neighboring countries, which are including in the IGAD community, don't have the same views how to tackle the situation in South Sudan. Some countries are united in supporting the government of Mr. Salva Kiir, and some other countries have sympathies with the former Vice President, Mr. Riek Machar. So we don't see a united front from the members of this group, which is crucial in bringing pressure on both fighting factions in order to make them adhere and implement the ceasefire agreement.
And do you believe that it's only in the hands of the rebels to end the bloodshed in the country and the chaos which is happening now in South Sudan, and to have a real peace deal to end this dangerous situation in the country?
The neighboring countries have limited influence on the situation in South Sudan. They can assist in humanitarian assistance. The United Nations is sending food supplies, the FAO and the World Health Organization, but without the people of South Sudan coming together to find an agreement among themselves, I don't think the situation will stop deteriorating day by day.
What do you mean, the people of Sudan to find an agreement between themselves? The rebels and the government, or the people themselves?
Yeah, both, all sides. The rebels and the government, elders of tribes, personalities. The population should exert pressure on those who are still fighting in order to come to an agreement which will be a lasting agreement, not just a stage in the fighting process.
And do you believe it's a matter of lack of trust between